You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Canon Fodder.
Grab your bookmarks, it's time to take cover as we unleash the Canon Fodder over the Star Wars galaxy of literature. On this special edition of the show, recorded at Farthest From's virtual convention, Empire40, my co-host Mark Newbold talks to comic book legend Walt Simonson about his work on Star Wars comics. Simonson originally worked on a single Star Wars comic, The Hunter, where he famously co-created the fan-favourite character with Archie Goodwin of Valance, who now stars in his own ongoing comic series some 30 plus years later. Simonson would then go on to become a regular writer, artist and cover artist for the original Marvel ongoing. Let's head over to Mark and Walt for this wonderful in-depth discussion.
We're here at Empire40. I'm here with Walt Simonson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
We're here obviously celebrating Empire Strikes Back 40th anniversary, and we couldn't do a show without talking to one of the people whose work is indelibly linked to that era. I'm going to ask the most open, easy question to kick this all off.
Okay, good.
Your general memories of that time, not necessarily what you were doing on Star Wars at that time, but just generally what were you doing career-wise when you came into the world of Star Wars?
Let's see. This would have been after the second movie. So what were we talking about, 1981 or thereabouts?
Yeah.
You know, I hadn't begun writing yet, I don't think. I got into comics as an artist, and that's pretty much where I stayed. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I did do a little writing. I began writing with Battlestar Galactica, which was, I think, out in 78 or 79. Yeah. So I probably had a little bit, but I had a chance on Star Wars to work with David Michelini, who was a good friend of ours. We used to live on the west side of Manhattan, and for a while David moved into that area before he moved out of the city itself. So we knew David really well, and I had a tremendous admiration for him as a writer. So it was really it was a nice gig to get to do Star Wars, and I was working on it at the time. There was a brief period where I felt I was getting to do all the science fiction in comics. I didn't want to type myself, but I thought, well, it's kind of happening that way. So I did the Alien graphic novel for Heavy Metal. I did Battlestar Galactica. I did the adaptation with Archie Goodwin of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I did Star Wars. I drew a couple of covers for Star Trek. I never drew a Star Trek comic. But for a little while, I had the market cornered in science fiction on comic books.
Was that a good feeling? Because, that was such a fertile time for sci-fi, wasn't it, back then?
It was. It was fun. I was when I was in high school, which was back in the 60s, mid-60s, early 60s, really, I'd become a science fiction reader. I read a lot of science fiction sort of through college and into probably into the early mid-70s. I think when I came to New York, I was still reading science fiction. Haven't read much in a long time now, but I read essentially all the old classics. So I read all the Isaac Asimov and the Robert Heinlein and the Arthur C. Clarke, and some of the fantasy-related stuff like Michael Moorcock, who did both science fiction and fantasy. And I became a giant Tolkien fan. I read The Lord of the Rings, which got out of science fiction. But I did read a lot of that stuff at the time. Some really well known, some was not as well known. I kind of just grazed, as it were. For a time in '69, I worked when I graduated from college. I took a year off and ended up working in a bookstore. And in the bookstore, I became the resident science fiction now knowledgeable person, I guess.
Yeah.
They had we had a very small science fiction collection when I began working there. Literally about 3 feet long, and I made it my mission to try and get at least one copy of every science fiction paperback in print, fantasy as well, into the store. And by the time I left after a year, but I went back every summer for 3 years. So by the time I was done, and science fiction had really taken off, science fiction and fantasy, partly probably thanks to Tolkien, had really taken off as a genre, and there were tons of science fiction books by then. So we had I'd guess probably 6 shelves, each shelf being about 6 to 8 feet long. So we had about 12 shelves, 8 to 6 feet or 6 to 8 feet long, just full of nothing but science fiction and fantasy. So we improved a great deal from the short shelf that I started with. So I try to keep track. I met some science fiction fans because of it, because they would come in to browse the books. I got to be friends with some of them, and so I had a lot of science fiction connection back in the early 70s. So by the time Star Wars came out, I wasn't reading as much science fiction, but I still had some connections to feel. I still loved the stuff, and so it was fun to be offered that book. Just because Star Wars was fun anyway, but it did fit in with some interests of mine that had preceded Star Wars.
Star Wars at the time, it's been said that if Star Wars hadn't have come along as a license that Stan Lee and Marvel picked up, the company could have been in serious trouble. And of course, the first issue sold 1 million copies and made history. So, how important was Star Wars to Marvel at the point that you came in on it? Obviously, Star Wars has come out, been a monster hit. Empire's come out. It's still one of your premier titles. So, how did that feel getting involved in it at that point?
Well, I mean, it was fun. I have heard that Star Wars license saved Marvel. I'm the wrong guy to talk to about that because I never got to look at Marvel's books, probably for good reason. And so you'd probably want to talk to Roy Thomas about stuff like that. He's probably the last guy around who was really involved at the very beginning of Marvel's involvement with Star Wars. Charlie Lippincott, who was a licensed guy for Fox, who made a lot of that stuff happen, just died fairly recently. Yeah. And he left a bunch of information. He was trying to write a book, I think. I knew Charlie from the Alien license. He had been the guy who had arranged that with Heavy Metal. So I don't know the truth of it, but I have heard that Marvel really saved Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars saved Marvel. I hadn't really heard that at the time, but it might have been true. As I said, I wasn't privy to the books at Marvel. But I mean, when I began doing Star Wars, it's a little like it's what you get now is different from what you got then. I mean, now, occasionally people will say, wow, Walt, what was it like to work on, and then they crank up the echo chamber and say, Star Wars. Yeah. And really at the time, there was no echo chamber. It was, Star Wars, the first movie that came out, it was very successful. The kind of licensing that you would have now that you just have Star Wars stuff everywhere was only beginning to happen. I think it took it was well after the first movie came out before any action figures were released. Initially, the movie came out in May, isn't that right? Yeah. And by Christmas, they did not yet still have action figures out that year. And so what you could buy was you bought essentially a script that was your promise to get the action figure when it was released. So kids were getting scripts that first Christmas that they could trade in for the action figure once the figures came out. I don't know when they did come out, but they were by a year down the road, they had come out. It was big. The whole deal was big. There was a big theater in New York. I can't remember the name of it now. It wasn't the Astor Plaza. It was something else, I think. Somebody else will know the answer to this. But there was a large theater, not too far, just off 42nd Street and Broadway, and they showed Star Wars for over a year. If you can imagine these days any movie ever showing in the same big theater for an entire year, because they took out a newspaper ad, and the newspaper ad had a big "Happy First Birthday Star Wars," and they had a lot of the little action figures scattered around. It was a full-page ad scattered around in the photographs. So I know by the time a year was up, the action figures were actually out and available. But it hadn't even then, it hadn't become the property it's become now. So when I did the comic, it was fun. It was neat. My checks cleared, so Marvel was doing okay. But it was like doing a comic book. It was rather than, wow, I'm working on Star Wars. I mean, you'd say, wow, I'm working on Star Wars, but you wouldn't put that echo chamber behind it at the time. And it was really, it was a slightly odd time to be doing the comic. It worked out. I thought it worked out pretty well. David wrote some really good stories, but we had some constrictions that we had to work with, which were not obvious when we started, but they became obvious as we went along. Star Wars was kind of looking over the company was looking over the comics. They were not as invested in making sure the comics, towed whatever continuity was going on, because at the time there wasn't a sense of the comics joined at the hip with the movies and the property in general. I mean, I think it's much more like that now. It wasn't like that then. I heard a story. I have no idea if it's true. I hope George Lucas will forgive me if this isn't true. But the story was that George Lucas's comment about the movie and the licensing, essentially, was that the movies were gospel and that everything else was gossip.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah.
And that was kind of how it was with the comics. So we weren't constrained by what had happened in the movie exactly, but there were some constraints. I mean, for example, our first story came out a few issues after the movie adaptation that Al Williamson and Archie Goodwin did. And David's first idea for a story, I've told this elsewhere, but his first idea for a story was, okay, the Empire builds a new Death Star, and they put chicken wire over the exhaust ports and get going. And the word came back from Lucasfilm, said, oh, we're sorry, you can't do that. We can't tell you why not. And, I mean, we're not complete dummies. We looked at each other and said, oh, I get it, movie number 3, which turned out to be true. Yeah. So instead, we did a story, 2-part story, where, because we got back to him, so, well, how about if we do a gigantic floating fortress in space with a big cannon on the front that can blow up planets, but it won't be spherical? And they said, okay, fine. So we got to do our Death Star story. We just didn't call it the Death Star. We called it the Tarkin, which I thought was a great name for it, honestly. And it wasn't right. It wasn't spherical. It was a giant 3-dimensional drawing in space, floating in space. And it did have the convex, or concave, rather, had the concave cannon on the front of it. They didn't object to that either, so we got to tell the story. But we couldn't, for example, use Han Solo, because Han was in carbonite. And we were told that we couldn't have any kind of romance between Luke and Leia. They couldn't tell us why. I didn't really guess they were brother and sister, but at that point, we just said, okay, we can't do that. We couldn't show Darth Vader and Luke together. So essentially, we had our constrictions were that we couldn't use one of the main heroes. We couldn't have anything going on between the 2 heroes we had left, and we couldn't show our hero and the main bad guy together. And so the stories that we did were stories in and of themselves, but they had to work around those restraints. And I have to say, I thought we did a pretty good job. I think the one time Darth and Luke are on the same spaceship or whatever it was they were on, Starship, I forgot if it was a Star Destroyer or something else, they're around the corner from each other, and they're about to meet, and I think somebody opens the airlock behind Darth and sucks him out.
Yeah.
I think he managed to not die. I mean, we managed to get better. But there were things like that we did that we didn't do much with Han at all, I don't think. We did have some bounty hunters, I think, in there, and some other things. But overall, the stories came out pretty well, and we were working within a series of restraints that I think were not obvious in the comic. I don't think anybody read those comics and went, "Oh, I get it. They can't show Han," or "Oh, I get it. They can't do anything here, can't do anything there." And which is the way you need to do it if you can. You try not to show the puppet master behind the puppets. So it worked out okay.
Yeah. It did. I mean, in that era, fans remember well Shara Bree as a lead character, obviously Cliff and the Hoojibs as lead characters. So there were new characters, new locations coming in that made it fit, because there wasn't the breadth of content coming out then that there is now. Like 3 or 4 Star Wars comics a month coming out now. You had your main title was the soap opera that kids of the time got. So you certainly did fill that gap very well.
Well, they had, I think now, like 1 million novels of the Star Wars properties. And at the time, I think Alan Dean Foster had Splinter in the Mind's Eye came out somewhere in there. I presume it came out before the second film. I'm not really sure. But you're right, there weren't there wasn't a lot of ancillary world building available to us, really. So we were doing what Archie Goodwin had written the book between the first and second films, a lot of those issues. Carmine drew some of them. I've forgotten who else was doing that stuff. Roy wrote some. And really, in a lot of ways, we were just kind of inventing stuff as we went along that felt to us as though it would fit in the Star Wars world for what we knew of the world, which was the first two movies, really.
Was it ever a frustration, because you're essentially playing in somebody else's sandbox, and there are preconceived future plans which obviously you had to tiptoe around? Was it ever a frustration that, for example, you couldn't have Darth Vader turn up, or you couldn't, although you did dance around that in quite clever ways, or you couldn't have Han Solo because he was basically a coffee table at that point, or did you kind of like the thought of you could work stories in to fit with this pre-existing storyline that's leading, obviously, it was that beautiful 3-year gap to Return of the Jedi that you sit right in the middle of. So was that fun, or was it frustrating?
No, it was a lot of fun. Comics, they really only come out once a month. So even though I was on the book for, a year and a half or whatever I was on, that's probably about 18 issues or something of that sort. Not a lot of stuff. David stayed on after I was gone. But, and it may have been more frustrating for David, although I never got that impression. Mostly when you do comics, you frequently work within parameters of one sort or another. So it wasn't like it was new for us. It wasn't like it was an unusual problem we had to solve. And we had a lot of fun toys to play with. And at that time, because there wasn't sort of a Bible of Star Wars continuity or whatever there would be now, we were able to pretty much do what we wanted within that frame, and I don't know that we ever felt the constraints, especially. As I said, we were able to put Darth in there. We couldn't really use Han, but we had a lot of other stuff to play with. So, it wasn't, in some ways, it's not all that different from the way doing comics is normally. I mean, as long as I have worked a lot in the work for hire end of comic books most of my career. I've done a few things that were creator-owned. I'm doing a creator-owned book right now called Ragnarok, where I get to do my own version of the Norse myths. But having said that, much of my career has been spent laboring in the vineyards of companies. And so there are always kind of constraints, maybe more broad than, Star Wars was a smaller world at the time, I think, than, say, the Marvel Universe was, even by the late 70s, or early 80s. So there was more room to play, in a way, in the Marvel Universe. But there were still things you weren't going to do. There was, at the time, continuity was just beginning to become even more complex for Marvel, and so that was beginning to be something you had to work around as well. But I don't remember ever feeling, oh, well, darn, we can't use Han Solo this time around. It would be so much fun to use him. Would have been fun to use him. Would have been great to use him. But Luke was a good character. Leia was a good character, and they were characters that really, 22 pages a month, that's not a lot of material. And so you get a lot of room to play with those guys over a length of time. And we certainly did. So you have to ask David if he felt that. I never did. I don't think I ever felt constrained about it. I think we got a big laugh out of the idea we couldn't do a Death Star. That was pretty funny. But as I said, in that case, we just did a gigantic cannon floating in space, and they were perfectly happy with it. And I think calling it the Tarkin was a stroke of genius on David's part. So it was just it was fun to play in those vineyards while I had the chance to. And I got to buy an awful lot of Star Wars toys so I can have reference and all that stuff. TIE fighters and X-Wings and everything.
One of the perks of the job.
Hi, this is John Morton from The Empire Strikes Back, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Lucas famously owned a comic shop in New York at some point in the 70s. Was it Super Snipe, I think it was called?
That's what I heard. Again, a friend of mine, Ed Summer, was the guy who ran it, and I was maybe a part owner. I don't know. I'd heard that Lucas's money was behind it. Again, haven't talked to George lately, if ever, and so I don't know the answer to that. But I had heard that, and in fact, when Thor 337 came out, my first issue of Thor as a writer and artist, that was not long after the Star Wars stuff I did. Yeah. I went over. I was on the west side. Super Snipe was on the east side. I went over to Super Snipe to buy some extra copies because I picked up a couple at Marvel, and that's where I went to buy my copies. And I walked in and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's sold out." And I said, "It's what?" He said, it's sold out. I said, what do you mean it's sold out? And that's how I discovered that the first issue had done really well. But I did go. So I was at Superside. There were very few comic shops in the city at that point. And so I didn't go over on a regular basis. I was getting comps out of the company some. But I did go over to Superside a couple of times. And I knew Ed Summer. I got to know him some. I did a little work for him eventually, actually.
What were the notes coming back from Lucasfilm at the time? Because obviously it was their big license before they started to diversify. Obviously Indiana Jones had just around that time Raiders came out, so they were starting to spread their wings a bit. But what were the notes that came back from Lucasfilm that you were aware of?
Honestly, I don't remember any notes. I mean, you get stuff like, don't do a Death Star. There was something where at some point there was a story that involved, I think, little creatures on hang gliders, something like that. And it came back from Lucasfilm, oh, you can't do that. And I think it was sort of like, we can't do what? And so it was that kind of stuff. But there wasn't much of it. Let me just ask, hey, Wiz, do you remember ever getting many notes from Lucasfilm during your time? Yeah, we didn't, did we? No, we did. I mean, they weren't giving back notes on issues. It wasn't any. Maybe they do now. Hang on. Right, they didn't want us to do stuff that was going to be in the movie, but they didn't tell us in advance what that was. We would just stumble into it like the Death Star business. So, I mean, I don't know now if they give notes on every issue. In some ways, comics has become treated more as if they were movies, which I find kind of ridiculous because it's a, if I got paid as much as I would get paid for a movie, okay, fine, send me some notes. I'm not getting paid like that. I'm getting paid a lot less, so buzz off. So I don't, but we didn't get those kind of notes. It's just not that kind of business back in the 70s. So, and as I said, it was a small enough business. I did several licensed, properties. I wrote the movie adaptation for Indiana Jones, the first Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah. I wrote that one. There they had. I was a little bit later. They had a couple of things. I had some line in there I really liked, and they wanted it taken out. I've forgotten what it was now. Archie was the editor on it. In fact, I did it because Archie was supposed to write it, and he ended up being so busy he couldn't. And I had just written my first stuff, really, and he liked it. And so he stopped me in the hallway one day and said, hey, do you want to write? I got to do this movie adaptation. I'm just too busy. Do you want to write it? Like, there's 3 issues. John Buscema's penciling it, and Klaus Janson inking. And I went, sure, I don't care what it is. I'm happy to do it. Because they had something called Raiders of the Lost Ark, which at the time, that's what it was. It was something called Raiders of the Lost Ark. We had no idea. So I got to write the adaptation. And again, it was, there were 1 or 2 places where they wanted a line changed or they wanted one line deleted, but there were a couple of places where I stuck lines in I thought were appropriate, and they didn't come back and say take those out, things that weren't in the original script. Just a couple times, not much. But it was not a note-carrying business at the time. I don't know about now. I mean, in general, the companies that do licensed movies, the movie companies, I get the impression, keep a much closer eye on comics. And, I mean, things like likeness rights, which now various stars have to give their approvals. And it's one of the reasons I haven't done any movie stuff for a long time, is that I'm not interested in having X so-and-so star look over my drawings and tell me, no, you have to draw me better than that. You have to draw me more handsome or with fewer lines or whatever it's going to be. Because then a lot of your creative energy goes into satisfying those kind of demands, and it doesn't go into trying to make a good comic book. And my preference, if I can, is to make a good comic book. When I did Alien, Heavy Metal did have the rights to use likenesses, but nobody from the movie company or none of the stars came back to me and groused about their likenesses. I mean, I try to get them. I'm not a likeness guy generally. I do okay, but I'm not. I've got friends who are phenomenal likeness guys. But Sienkiewicz for one, John Bogdanov. But in my case, what I want to do is I want to do likenesses that I can turn into drawings that will fit the comic. Often, when you do this was, Tom Palmer was the inker on Star Wars, yes. And he was able to really make that stuff sing, because Tom is good at likenesses. He's quite good at art outside of comics. He's a good painter and a good portrait painter, a good likeness guy, good advertising art. And so I would give him the layouts, and he would, render the characters up, and it would work pretty well. And I think at that time they weren't coming back to us with likeness approvals or any of that sort of thing. But in Alien, what I really want to do, and the same is true in Star Wars. In Star Wars, the faces of those guys they look like they belong in the comic. Sometimes you'll see a movie adaptation or a TV adaptation, and a guy's face will be rendered like crazy, way out of sync with the rest of the drawing. I remember seeing an ad once for one of the wrestlers. I've forgotten. It was an advertisement, and it was a likeness of the wrestler, and the face was rendered like crazy, but the body was much more like comic books, and so the face just stuck out like a sore thumb. And I did not want that to happen in the comics. So in Star Wars, it worked out well, where we didn't have to wrestle with those kind of issues, and Tom was able to do some drawings. I thought the whole thing just fit together quite beautifully.
Before you
Tom also had a son who was very young at the time, who was a gigantic Star Wars fanatic, and Tommy would lean over his father's shoulder and make sure he was drawing the spaceships correctly.
Quality control.
The Millennium Falcon had to look just right, or the Imperial cruisers, or the whatever the cruisers were that the Rebels had. They had to be just right. So he had some expert help on hand.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds. Bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Well, Marvel at the time, I mean, I was 13 in 84, so, you know, when I really started collecting American comics, obviously being in the UK, we got weeklies over here, there was a very much a family feel that was given off to the reader about being a part of the bullpen, you know, part of the Marvel team. What was it actually like?
You know, in at least for me, it wasn't so different from that. There was a bullpen. Let's see, in '84. Where was Marvel then? They were at 575 Madison for a number of years when I first got into comics, up near between 56th and 57th Street, and then they moved at some point. Probably. Hey, Wiz. When you started at Marvel, were they still at they were still at 575, right in the middle of Weezy's time at Marvel as an editor. She was there from 80 through 83. She was there 4 years as an editor, and they were at 575, and then during that time they moved down to Park Avenue South, and they were on Park Avenue South and 28th Street, I'm going to say. And but in both cases, they had a bullpen that was usually pretty bustling. There were a number of people that worked there, mostly young guys, some women. And then they had people like Marie Severn and early on John Verporten, later Danny Crespi, head of production. All the offices were there for all the editors, the editor-in-chiefs, the publishers. Usually the business people, the suits, were usually on a floor above somewhere. I've forgotten what all the floors were now, but they were usually on a different floor. But you would come in. At that time, you had to pretty much bring your artwork in to the office when it was finished. There were no scanners. FedEx was around by then, but if you lived in the city, you didn't really use FedEx to get to the office. You just carried your work down there. And when I first came into New York in '72, none of that stuff existed. So no overnight delivery, no internet, no scanners, no any of those things. And what that meant was that if you wanted to do comic books, you lived pretty much in the city or very close by it in the burbs, and then you brought your work in. If you were older and established, say John Buscema, Sal Buscema, John Severn, they could live further out. Several of them lived, a couple of them lived out on Long Island, one of them lived down in Virginia, other guys lived in Colorado, out in California. I think Jack Kirby moved to California, and they could send stuff, usually a 2 or 3 day delivery. It was not guaranteed overnight, but they were old pros and were usually far enough ahead in their deadlines. That wasn't a problem. But usually I turned my stuff in, and the ink was still wet. But it was, it was kind of a family business. There were, in a way, you would take your work in, you would see other guys. I knew all the guys of my generation because of that. Some of them became really close friends. Some of them we just stayed friends, but we weren't that close. I wouldn't see all of them a lot. But you also, there was a time you would be the right age. You'd be about the age of like the various editors that you were working for. The assistants maybe might be a shade younger. And so it was a social group as well. I remember I'm going to say 74, whenever Kung Fu films finally came to New York and hit New York, there was a movie called 5 Fingers of Death.
Yes.
And I'm sure there were a lot of other kung fu films before that. And there may have been some in New York and some of the other theaters, I don't know, but that played down around 42nd Street. And, a lot of us heard about it. And so just a whole ton of us got together and went down and saw Five Fingers of Death. It was a terrible film, but it was so much fun. We had a great time. There was a lot of that kind of stuff. There was a time for a couple of years, a couple of summers, where a bunch of freelancers and the Marvel staff, we were volleyball fanatics. And we played volleyball in the summertime, like right now, this time of year. Jim Shooter had Marvel buy a volleyball and a volleyball net. And we'd keep it at the office. And then the minute the office closed at 5, we'd all gather together, grab it, go over to Central Park, set it up, and play volleyball until it got dark, until it was too dark to not see the ball anymore. Or too dark to see the ball anymore.
Didn't Jim have an advantage? Wasn't Jim about 10 foot tall?
Jim was he was a tall guy. But it's hard to cover the entire court, so It gave the rest of us a chance to play. And we had so many people. I mean, honestly, we had so many people who wanted to play. We sometimes had to rotate people. We had 3 rows of 3 players on each side of the court. You had 9 players on each side of the court, and there were times we had to rotate people in and out, 2 or 3 people as well. So you'd have 9, 18. You'd have 23, 24, 25 people playing volleyball. So it was, and then as each team lost a serve, you'd rotate one person, and then the next guy would step up and serve, and that was a mixture of men and women actually. But it was really, that was great. Often you'd go out afterwards and go to Nathan's, have a hot dog, or go somewhere and grab a little light dinner, or some. As we were all younger then, and we didn't worry about our cholesterol, crap dinner of some kind. But it was fun, and that's really that was a great time. As far as I'm concerned, it was a great time to be doing comics. In a way, it was kind of a golden age because you could do the comics you wanted to do. Even on Star Wars, David and I pretty much got to do the stories that we wanted to do, the stories that David wrote. And that was true of other comics. So when I was doing Thor in 83, 84, 85, I got to tell the stories I wanted to tell. And it was really, Frank the same way on Daredevil. Did some fabulous work. There were a bunch of guys doing really wonderful work. John Byrne on the FF, Chris on the X-Men. And so that was a good time to be doing comics. Even the 70s and 80s, it was pretty free and easy. It was still, into the early, mid-80s, it was still kind of a small business. Also at the time, Neil Adams and Vic Giordano had a studio on East 48th Street, just off 5th Avenue, called Continuity Associates. They had started, and it was running by the time I got to New York in 72, and they were there was a lot of art that could be done. Now a lot of it would be computers, but back then it was so much it was handwork. And they had animatics, which are little partial animations to show what a commercial is going to look like when you film it, storyboards for movies, for TV, and they would do a lot of stuff outside comics as well as the comic book work. So, and they would rent out. They had a very nice studio on the second floor maybe. Maybe the 3rd floor, and they would rent out some of the space. So that became kind of a club. We'd all like a social club. So as a freelancer, you'd come in, you'd drop your stuff off at Marvel or DC, and then Continuity was sort of in between them. So you could go there and hang out, and you'd see a lot of other guys. Sometimes you'd pitch in and help on a job. That was what the Krusty Bunkers were. There were a bunch of guys in the studio who would jump in to help ink something generally. And it was fun. So you did get to know everybody. You were all kind of in the same game. None of us were making a ton of money. This is before royalties, before 82 or so, before royalties. So we weren't making a ton of money, but we were making enough to be able to live in New York at the time. It would be harder to do now, I think. But it was great. It was really, and it was, I knew the bullpen guys, and we just got to hang out with those guys and go out and socialize, and it was fun. Talk comic books, talk everything, really.
You've got a very distinctive style that people who are into comics recognise instantly. How much did that style develop whilst you were working on Star Wars? Because clearly it was well in place by the time you got to Thor.
Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I was still, when I was doing Star Wars, I was doing layouts rather than tight pencils. I went through a period. The first work I did when I got into comics was fine. I saw something post on, I think, Facebook talking about Rick Leonardi. There's a Facebook page devoted to Rick. And if I'm right about that, I remember if it really was Rick. I don't know. Now I may be not remembering it correctly, but it sounds as though he very rarely has inked his own work. And that was really true. Often, if you got into comics, you got in, if you were on the art side, either as a penciler or as an inker. And somehow when I got into comics, I brought in samples where I had my own drawing and my own inking. And so a lot of my early work was work that I both penciled and inked, and that's still generally true. But I have gone through periods where I have not inked the work I was doing. I did X Factor, Louise, she wrote it, and Bob Wyacek inked most of those. But in the early days when I was trying to learn how to draw better. I think the biggest jump you can see in my stuff, at least professionally, is probably in the middle of the Manhunter work I did for DC. I did a strip called Manhunter that Archie Goodwin created and wrote. I designed the character. It ran as a backup, eight-page chapters as a backup to Detective Comics in 73, 74. Ran for a year. It was 7 issues, so it was just over a year, because it was bi-monthly. And somewhere around, I don't know, chapters, I think between chapter 3 and chapter 4, and almost in the middle of one of those chapters, maybe in the middle of, if I remember the shop, I can't remember which issue it was in, I have to go look. But my work took a turn where the drawing and the inking were noticeably better, noticeably improved, made a jump. And if you look at the first Manhunter and the last Manhunter together, you can see there was a jump over this year of my ability to control the pen, to control my rendering, and the drawing itself in a way that hadn't been as true in the beginning. It wasn't bad in the beginning, but I really did make a jump there. And then after that, you just make kind of a series of jumps. You're not always aware of it. The Star Wars work and some of the work I did before, Rampaging Hulk I did earlier, where I did 3 44-page issues where I did layouts for Doug Mensch was writing it, and Alfredo Alcala inked it, or did the finishes, really. And part of that was because when I did Manhunter, it was taking about a page a week. I was taking about a week on a page of pencils and inks. Don't ask me how I survived. I have no idea how I made any money out of that in New York City, even in the old days. But I wanted to learn to make storytelling decisions faster on a page. How do I really make a decision to put this panel here and that panel here? What's in this panel? What's in that panel? How do I compose a panel? How do I compose an entire page? How do I get it all to fit together? And do it in a way that I can think faster about this and more clearly and more expansively. And so I took on the gig of layouts for several books over time, because I could just concentrate on the storytelling and composition, and I wasn't worried so much about the rendering or how I was actually drawing a figure or a face or an eyeball. And by the time I got to Star Wars, I'd been doing some of that stuff. I'd done layouts for Hercules Unbound at DC. I'd done layouts for Rampaging Hulk. Maybe a little more here and there, and I'd done a lot more drawing. I'd drawn a graphic novel by that time with the Star Slammers. And so I when I got onto Star Wars, I had kind of gone through that, and so I was better at layouts. And I got, as I said, I still have them. I got a ton of old magazines and trade paperback, like large, thin paperbacks with photographs from the original 2 movies. I don't have so much from Return of the Jedi, a little bit, but that was after my time in the book. But I got a bunch of those books, whatever was available. There was a ton of stuff out in the market, out in the newsstands eventually. I got a ton of that stuff, and I bought some of the models that were available for reference, and that gave me a good handle on drawing Luke and drawing Leia. Chewie was actually hard to draw. He was hard to draw right. You wouldn't have thought so exactly, but there was something about you had to get the shape of his head just right. Yeah. And sometimes I got it, and sometimes I didn't quite catch it. I depended on Tom to save my ass.
When your time on Star Wars came to an end, was that a conscious decision by yourself that now it's time to move on to something else? Did Thor come onto your horizon and it was just too tempting to miss, or how did that work?
I don't know. I don't remember. I didn't get fired. I remember that, but I think I decided to move on. I don't know I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at what time or what year that ended, and the month. It's possible that I began doing the Star Slammers graphic novel after that. Because I don't remember where that fit in with Galactica. Galactica was the first time I began writing. The last 5 issues of Galactica were my first writing attempts in comics. And those are whatever that was. When did Raiders of the Lost Ark come out? Do you remember?
81.
81. So Galactica was right before that. So I was wrapping that up. So I probably did Galactica first. And then Raiders came along because Archie, when he passed me in the hall and asked if I wanted to do it, one of the reasons for that was because he had read the 4 issues of Galactica I had written. And we'd worked together before, but I was like the artist, not the writer. I'd learned an enormous amount from him, but I wouldn't have presumed to put myself forward as a writer at that point. I'm still not sure about that. And he called me in the hall and said that he really liked the Galacticas, and that's why he offered me writing Raiders. And so I wrote the 4 Galacticas, 3 Raiders, and then somewhere in there, probably after Star Wars, I wrote the Star Slammers graphic novel, which was about 60 pages or so, which is about 3 comic books. So when I was offered Thor, I was talking to Mark Grunwald. I probably got off the Star Wars maybe to do the Star Slammers, to go ahead and put this graphic novel. Marvel was instituting a graphic novel program at about that time, and they wanted to put together, they wanted to publish both properties that they owned, as well as creator-owned properties. They were kind of looking around generally in all directions. I think Jim Starlin did The Death of Captain Marvel as the very first graphic novel they published. He did a great job. And Archie was editing that stuff, I think, that line, and he actually used the Alien graphic novel from Heavy Metal from a few years earlier as the template for Marvel's graphic novels. The size and the way it was put together were really taken from the Alien graphic novel. So, again, small industry, everything kind of fits together. But I did the Star Slammers graphic novel. And then about the time that was wrapping up, I was talking to Mark Grunwald. And I had been a big Thor fan before I came to Marvel. I mean, I read it back when I was in college in the early 60s, or mid-60s. And I'd been a big Norse myth fan from before that when I was a child. So I was thrilled to discover there was a comic book. I expect I talked to Mark about that. I had some ideas for stories much earlier, back in the late 60s, when I was a big fan of the material, but I never thought about drawing it and writing it. And eventually I turned my hand to trying to draw a little of it, of the story I wanted to do just for fun. And that was before I got into comics professionally. I was about 69 or 70, so a couple of years before I came to New York. And then once I was in New York, I'm sure I was talking, I don't remember for sure, but I'm sure I was talking to Mark about this stuff, including kind of the stories, ideas I had and what I kind of wanted to do. And my understanding, again, I can't ask Mark about this now, but my understanding is that Thor wasn't doing very well at the time. And so when Mark offered me the book, after, I'd written all of, 10 comics maybe, he asked if I wanted to take over the book as the writer and the artist, and if I did it, I would have carte blanche. I'd be able to do whatever I wanted to with the character, including killing him off and starting fresh if I wanted to. I didn't want to. I liked the old character. But he did want me to understand that I could do whatever I wanted to try and, just to do stories. And it was a good place to be. It was like, the book's tanking anywhere. It's not doing very well. So if the book tanks, nobody will blame me. They'll just say, well, it was going downhill anyway. And if it does well, they'll say, wow, that Simonson guy, what a genius. So I don't know if they said that, but the book didn't tank, so that was good.
It certainly did.
But I think I just, I'd done a year and a half of Star Wars, and I think I was kind of ready to move on after that.
Hello, this is Sam Whitwer, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks.
So to wrap this up, your abiding memory then of being on that Star Wars title, it was clearly for you professionally, it was a very good time to be on a main Marvel title like that. It had all the profile that you could want. What are your sort of takeaways from that era? It was fun. I'm glad I had a chance to work on Star Wars. I'm glad I had a chance to work on it early enough so we had a lot of elbow room to tell the stories we wanted to tell. I don't know that I could do one of those now. I've done a couple of things.
not in a long time now, where there's a lot more oversight from the. Well, here's my short take. At the time I was doing Star Wars, excuse me, and I've said this elsewhere, my view of comics is it was creativity from the bottom up. You were given a book, whether it was Thor or Star Wars or the Fantastic Four or Battlestar Galactica, licensed property or a Marvel property or a DC property, and you could tell the stories you wanted to tell. I mean, again, within limits. I'm not going to do some X-rated Fantastic Four stories, but there was still a big world to play in, and you had all that room to play in. More recently, really starting in probably the early 90s, but certainly much more true now, my view of comics is it's kind of creativity from the top down. Now, maybe someone who's younger was not, if you talk to a younger creator, they might not see it like this, and that would be perfectly understandable. But my view is that now with all the crossovers that companies want, that an awful lot of stuff is dictated from the guys at the top. And, well, a lot of those guys are friends of mine, and I admire them creatively and as writers. I'm not always eager to tell their stories. And so I haven't done a lot of mainstream work in some time because I've just really had more fun kind of doing what I did in the old days, which is telling my own stories. And that these days involves more doing my own characters rather than going back. I do occasionally go back and do stuff. Right now I'm doing I'm drawing a 12-page Batman story that Tom King has written. And I've known Tom for a few years. I really like him. I like his work. This opportunity came along in between arcs of Ragnarok, and I thought, we're all shut down because of COVID anyway. So, but this job is available, and I'd like to do this. So I am of course desperately late getting it done. But so far, I'm inking it now. I've got it all pencil. I'm inking it. I've got a complex page to finish tonight. After we're done talking and I have dinner, I'll go back to doing that. But it's kind of fun to go back. I'm done Batman. I'm in a story with Batman in about 10 years. I did one in a book called The Judas Coin I wrote and drew 10 years ago for DC. I've drawn a couple of Batman covers since then, and occasionally I get asked to do covers these days, like mostly variant covers, which is perfectly fine. They don't pay you variant rates for it, so that's all right. But it's kind of fun going back and doing the old guy. I have to kind of refigure out what to do. And one of the things about Batman for me is that he was always incredibly flexible for what you could do with the character visually. His long-eared phase, his short-eared phase, the squat phase, the long, graceful phase, whatever you wanted to do. Nowadays you can change a lot of characters, but back in the old days even, I thought Batman had more visual flexibility than most of the characters in comics. And so when I've done Batman, which has not been all that often, I have often done a somewhat varied version of Batman. The Batman I drew in Manhunter was had long ears, kind of out of Neil's work, long ears and a karate guy, and tried to make him graceful and kind of clean cut. When I did a few years later, I did a story called The Cape and Cowl Death Trap that Elliot Magan wrote, and that one, I did a Batman that was probably 4 feet high and could kick your ass and had short ears. It wasn't really 4 feet high, but he was very blocky and very much not antithetical to what I'd drawn just a few years earlier. And now I'm just drawing him now. Probably a little more superhero-y build. I've just done those guys wrong. But I want a guy who's not going to be as short as the character I drew in 75, but I have given him shorter ears again. There's an artist, and I'm not going to remember his name, which is going to be awful here on an interview. Let me see if I can take a few moments. I picked up a copy of a graphic novel, or it's a collection he did. I think it was called White Knight, and it was there we go, Batman White Knight. Sean Murphy. Sorry, Sean. Right. My apologies. Anyway, I thought it was beautifully done. I wish there had been more Batman in it. There's a lot of Joker. I love the Batman he drew. And I wouldn't say that the Batman I'm doing is somewhat inspired by the one he drew. It won't look like it by the time I'm done. My drawing is nothing like his. But it was really inspirational. John Paul Leon has done some really beautiful Batman figures, and so I kind of look at that stuff. I'm not saying I get anything out of it that I can that'll really be visible in the final work, but I do like looking at other influences and seeing if I can bring some of what I like in that work into my own stuff, which makes, it's what keeps the drawing interesting. I'm trying not to draw the same thing every time I leave the horse box and out of the gate and down the racetrack. I try to make the stuff as different as or somewhat different, or rethink it or whatever. And Batman seems like a really good candidate for rethinking at least each of the times I've done them. Again, I haven't done them a whole lot in my career, the oddball story here and there, really. But he's always fun to do. Always fun to do. So that's what I've been doing recently, and as well as I've been doing some commission work and some other stuff like that. And I've done some drawings for charity, which have been up on eBay and raised a few bucks for people that need bucks. So that's worked out pretty well.
Well, just occurs to me as we finish this off, you did the cover to issue 108, the recent addition to the old Marvel line with Valance on the cover.
I did.
Yeah.
I guess I did 2 Star Wars covers. Yes, I did that one with Valance and Vader. I drew Valance in 78 or 79? Yeah. 78 probably. And it was issue 16 of Marvel Star Wars, really early on. Archie wrote it, created the character, and I drew him. And it was interesting. It was fun to go back, and it's always fun to draw Vader anyway. It was fun to go back and draw Valance. And then there was a recent comic, I don't remember what it was, you'll have to look it up and put a footnote in this, where Marvel was doing sort of Star Wars, like great moments in Star Wars. I forget what they called it, something like that. And you could choose a moment in the Star Wars movies and down the road, and choose that moment to do your drawing and do your cover. And when they got a hold of me, they had a bunch of moments that had been taken, but I think a lot of them in the first movie, which is my favorite of the films. But even the movies I don't like as much as that first. And there are moments here and there I really like a lot. And I checked with them. Nobody had done it. So I did a picture of Vader hoisting the Emperor up over his head as he's about to throw him down the tubes or whatever that thing is, that shaft. It would kill him. And one of my favorite things about that scene is as the Emperor is firing lightning bolts and crackle everywhere, every so often you get a flicker and you can see Vader's skeleton inside his costume, which I thought was just awesome at the time. I still think it's just phenomenal. And so I got to draw that scene. I didn't draw any background to it. It's all Kirby crackle everywhere. But I got to draw Vader and try to figure out how to draw his skeleton inside the costume and still have it be Vader. And I thought that worked out okay. So I like that drawing. That one came out pretty well.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for all the memories. Thanks for all the fun that we had as kids reading those comics. And it resonates today. It really does. People still get a kick out of it hugely. So thanks for giving us so much of your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I hope we can make something sensible out of all this. And thanks for putting up with my being hard to get pinned down for an interview.
Not a problem.
Thanks for listening to Canon Fodder. If you want to be part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com and download the Fanthatracks app to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. And remember to comment, like, share and subscribe on all our social medias at Fanthatracks. Leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcaster or smart speaker of choice.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's Making Tracks.